So good afternoon, everybody. Now we are going to start this session about exposure situations and categories of exposure. And we are the members of task group 127 in ICRP. And the aim of our task group is to review the concepts and the implementation of exposure situations and the categories of exposure using the current system, and to consider whether and what adjustments may be appropriate. And today we have 4 speakers here. And first, and I'm Hiroko Yoshida, and okay.
Yes, good afternoon. We co-chair the session with my colleague Hiroko Yoshida, and my name is Analia Canova. Let me introduce Hiroko. Hiroko is a FIDI research professor in Tohoku University of Japan. She had been supervising all matters associated with radiation control and radiation safety in the university, and she's an IRP Executive Council and a Committee 4 member of ICRP.
Thank you for kind introduction. And Analia Canova, my colleague, so she is a biochemist that works in the Nuclear Regulatory Authority from Argentina, so radiation protection specialist since more than 25 years. Her main areas of expertise are radon norm, radiological environment impact assessment, and radiochemical laboratories. And she is a member of C4 since 2013, and being co-chair of Task Group 98 and co-chair of Task Group 125. So we will be the co-chair in this session. Then we have the other speakers, and first so unfortunately, our task group's chair is Yan, but he can't come to Japan this time. And on behalf of him, the Analia will introduce the introduction. So the Then before that, our reporter. So Yes, Mr. Yuji Inukai from Chiyoda Technology Company, and he serves as a reporter in this session. Please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yuji Inukai from Personal Radiation Monitoring Service Business of Chiyoda Technology Corporation. It is a great honor to be able to speak to you. Today, I'd like to introduce some of posters and video presentations. There will be approximately 250 poster and video presentations at ICRP 2023. My presentation covers 3 poster presentations. 2 of that presentation is exposure categories and situations of session 9, and 1 of the presentation is justification of session 14. I'd like to start by talking about determination of safe radiation distance from 16 flight multi-detector computed tomography scan machine by Andre Hodgson et al. The purpose of this study is survey the locations with the least radiation dose inside the CT scan room while performing examination. Philips Brilliance 16-slice MD-CT scanners and CTDI Phantom were used. The dosimeter used was Unforced RaySafe XI. It has been calibrated. Dosimeter was placed 1 location at a time using the clock phase pattern by radiation sign in figure 1. It was found that The safer distance from radiation source were 1 meter and 2 meters away at 9 o'clock position, and 1 meter away at 3 o'clock position, which are on the side of the CT scanner where radiation dose was decreased by half. Second, radiation risk assessment of krypton containing electron tube by Eugene Van et al. The purpose of this study is evaluate the appropriateness of exempting metal halide lamps and krypton tube bulbs containing radioactivity greater than the regulatory exemption criteria of 10 kilobecquerel. Therefore, predictable disposal scenarios and accident exposure scenarios were developed and radiation risks were evaluated for each scenario. One scenario for disposal exposure conditions is waste fluorescent lights at recycling center. 3 scenarios were developed were accident exposure conditions. First, damage during individual replacement. Second, traffic accident. Finally, storage warehouse fire. They evaluated the radiation dose for all exposure scenarios. The results were compared with the IAEA regulatory exemption criteria for electron tubes containing radioactivity greater than the general exemption criteria, and they were all below the IAEA exemption criteria, although the scenario factors were set conservatively. Here, this slide shows other presentations of Session 9 exposure categories and situations. Finally, justification and optimization of pediatric CT in prefecture around Tokyo by Osamu Miyazaki et al. In Japan, there are currently 2 guidelines for suspected pediatric acute appendicitis. It's not known whether CT examinations are justified or optimized in daily practice. Therefore, they conducted a questionnaire survey to find out how pervasive their practice is at 1,194 facilities of emergency hospitals in the suburbs of Tokyo that provide pediatric emergency care. Asked, are you aware of the guidelines? Do you use the guidelines? What is the initial procedure performed when appendicitis is suspected? And other questions. The figure shows one of the results of the questionnaire. The survey results were obtained from 212 facilities, of which 169 had emergency outpatient care for pediatric acute abdomen cases. Awareness and use to the guideline were low. However, 80% of physicians choose ultrasound as their first choice for abdominal cases. In addition, awareness of diagnostic reference levels was high, and the exposure dosage also conformed to the DRL. In other words, the use to CT pediatric acute abdomen patients at medical facility in suburbs of Tokyo is justified and optimized. Here, this slide shows other presentation of session 14, justification. Thank you for your attention.
Okay. Thank you very much. And we are going to move to our session. And first of all, Analia Canova, she is going to give a talk, the breakthroughs of our task group 127. Okay, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Rocco. Well, the idea is to show you a summary of what we are doing in task group 127, that is related with categories and exposure situations. This task group started in January of 2023, and the idea is to analyze the integration of ICRP recommendations and how they are implemented in the international standards and national regulations. And it is realized that this integration poses some difficulties. There is to think and to understand how the current system of protection has been implemented and how effective this implementation has been in order to improve radiation protection. So our mandate, how we're going to develop, is to review ICRP publication 103 and subsequent publications in terms of exposure situations and in relation with category of exposure. The idea is to organize open workshops together with international organizations, because it's very important for us to have the feedback of international organizations. And we will pay special attention on how existing exposure situations have been implemented. We have an important group with experts from all over the world, and the chair is Mr. Jean Villarin from ISRN, that unfortunately he couldn't come from personal issues. And it's important that we have observers from the International Atomic Energy Agency and also from ILO. We have had an in-person meeting in Paris in April, a virtual meeting on September, and yesterday we have our hybrid meeting during this symposium. As you know, very quickly, the system of protection is based on 3 pillars. Not only the science, it is very important, but also the experience and how ethical and social values are applied. And as you know, this publication 103 has proposed recommended situations classified as planned, emergency, and existing, being the categories occupational, public, and medical, and also a very important broad aspect from applying environment protection of the environment, with the principles of justification, optimization, and limitation, with those criteria that introduce the concept of reference levels to applying in existing exposure situations. So we are going to analyze how this system of protection has been implemented, and also if we are going to clarify if it is more guidance in which aspect we are going to identify these aspects, bearing in mind that the system on what we are going to do has to be fit for purpose for the incoming years, taking into account the novel technologies, the wider scale decommissioning issues, and the societal changes and climate change. So we had to assure that has to be not only implementable today, but for the incoming years. So we had to take into account the consequences of progresses, looking for the science, for example, the new phantoms, the new models. This will apply a new series of those coefficients, the new studies on health effects, new epidemiological studies, the detriment calculation, the cardiovascular disease, all what we have heard during these days. very important experience, for example, for Fukushima accident. Still, we will see there are some complexity of different situations having at the same time in the same country. How address occupational exposure framework, for example. The transition between exposure situations is not clear. We need more guidance. And how to handle these new situations that have been introduced in ICRP 103, this existing exposure situation, just an example of things that we have to address. And very important, the social and ethical values that we need to apply in practice, the relation in the principles and the ethical core values that were described in publication 138. We have an evolution of the social aspects. We have to take into account the views and concerns of stakeholders. And we realize that these societal and ethical values are becoming more and more important. Just to name the equity, the human right, how we take into account sustainability, the autonomy, the psychological distresses, economic damage, health risks, and more, and so on. So this is to show you very quickly the three types of exposure situations that we have the existing, then one thing not existing with the natural radionuclides, then we have the planned exposure situations, then we have the emergency, and then we have the transitions between the plan that could lead to an emergency and how the emergency then can lead to a legacy site on the recovery phase. So we need more guidance how to apply the recommendations in these transitions. So what is at stake in our task group? We need to respond to this question. Is the system sufficiently enough understood? We realize that the CRP 103 is very clear for planned exposure situations, but we need to give more details about existing exposure situations, although we have specific publications on radon, norm, cosmic, large nuclear accidents, taking into account the recovery phase, the legacy sites. We also need to give more guidance on how the principles are applied according to the exposure situation, and we need to work together very interrelated with TG 114, which is how to apply tolerability and reasonableness, and TG 124, how is to apply the principle of justification. Just to show you an example, it has to be clear which is the definition of existing exposure situation, that sometimes the word maybe not be existing or extant because there is some discrepancies or there are some differences between this. But just to share, we have to clarify that radiation in these cases is not deliberately introduced, that sometimes radiation usually is not the primary hazard. Then we need the characterization of exposures to see all the picture and say how we are going to apply decisions. Usually low levels of those are involved. We need to apply graded approach, but we need guidance how graded approach is applied in this existing exposure situation. And sometimes the possibilities to manage the situation are not the same as if you are in a planned exposure situation. And we will see in one presentation that maybe there is also a misunderstanding that as soon as an existing exposure situation is amenable to control, and it is decided to control this situation, many people think this is converted in a planned exposure because you can plan how to manage the situation. Just are examples. So what are we doing? What are we going to do in our task group? We are going to pull issues, to recognize issues, to identify issues, try to analyze the reason why they are not well understood, why we need more clarification, taking into account the experience of the implementation of the people. So we are going to, as I said, to work together with international organizations to analyze their feedback, and also the issues raised for the expert members of the task group. The idea is to clarify the concepts of the exposure situations and the categories, looking for an adequate implementation in international frameworks. We're going to look for the definitions, the transitions, the application of limits, constraints, and reference level. And an important issue is the occupational exposure in existing exposure situations. the idea that the recommendation should be implementable in the regulatory framework in a reasonable way. So the main outcomes of today is to consider, besides we are going to analyze, clarify, give guidance, it's important to consider the stability of the system. There's still many countries that are implementing ICRP 103, but it is recognized that there's need of clarifications. To develop explanation about the system from ICRP and from other publications, the idea is to address key issues encountered during the implementation by practitioners, and we are performing an ongoing work on the outline of the report. So the speaker of this session, we will have 5 speakers, and the presentation will be about norm is always existing exposure situations, issues in the implementation of the system, connections between categories of exposure in the hospital setting, issues and confusion in existing exposure situation after Fukushima accident, and exposure categories and situations in the current system of radiation protection, and the challenge that are we are going to be presented from the agency perspective, taking into account member states' opinions. So, this is okay? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Analia. And we have some time, after the speakers get their talks. For a question and the comments from the floor, and we are going to move to next speaker. So, Chris. Okay, so Christopher Jones is head of radiation protection for an organization within the UK nuclear industry. He has a physics background and now specializes in actionable materials and radiation emergency response. His participation in the task group 127 is his first role within the ICRP, but he hopes not his last. So, okay, Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hirito. So I wanted to talk to you about norm this afternoon, really for 2 reasons. Firstly, because it's a topic that's come up quite a few times already in our task group, just following on from what Analia was just saying. That is an area that I think has quite a lot of misconceptions, isn't particularly understood. And also, I think it sort of typifies some of the broader topics and sort of challenges that we have as a task group. So there's quite a few things which are although I'm going to speak in relation to norm, actually apply sort of across quite a few of the exposure situation challenges. So it's not just me saying that. There's also, existing ICRP publications highlight some of the challenges with norm. So you've got quotes here from various sort of publications. But you can see the running theme across them is the Commission already recognises that norm is not an area that it's spent much time looking at. The recommendations mainly are focused on artificial sources, and that has led to quite a variation in how norm is looked after at a regional level. So I'm sure most people in this room are aware, but just for clarity, so what is norm? So naturally occurring radioactive material. The definition on the screen there is the one from ICRP 103. And you can see it's so naturally occurring radioactive material, but also in the ICRP definition talks about that includes even once that material has been transformed by changing the activity concentrations, as long as the nuclei present are still those that were there naturally occurring, that still counts as norm. So that means it covers everything from radon all the way through to something where you've actually potentially enriched or sort of changed the nuclei concentrations for a whole variety of different purposes. Again, I'm sure most people are aware of the definitions as well about the exposure situations we're talking about, but I just thought I'd put them up because they are quite important as we go and talk about why clarification is required. So these are from 103, and so you've got planned situation where protection can be planned in advance before the exposures occur, and where you can predict the magnitude and extent of exposure. And then the other one of relevance for norm is really the existing exposure situation at the bottom. So where it already exists when the decision on control has to be taken. And you can see the last line there sort of talks about radon and is in dwellings, and norm are well-known examples. So already it sort of lays out the idea that norm is automatically an existing exposure situation. However, that's actually the only place in the whole of ICRP 103 where you'll find mention of norm, is in that one definition. There's nothing further that sort of goes on to clarify that. A few other publications exist that sort of talk about things in relation to norm. So 104, 126, 142 all sort of cover different aspects of norm, and pretty much all continue that trend of saying it's an existing exposure situation. The only variance from that is the last one, where it says that if you're mining for uranium or thorium for its radioactive properties, then it's a planned situation. So if we put all that together, the summary of the current recommendations, mainly it's existing, but actually there's an awful lot of uses of norm which aren't really covered anywhere in the existing recommendations. And I think that gap is one of the reasons why you start then seeing inconsistencies and confusion creeping in, because there's a lot of cases out there where people just aren't quite sure. So for example, if you are choosing to use depleted uranium for as a very dense material for an aircraft weight, or as a container for a high activity source maybe, you're choosing to use that material, so it's norm, but I've changed. It's not as I dug it out the ground. I've made it into depleted uranium, and then I'm using it. I've chosen to use that over another dense material like lead or thorium, or tungsten. So you can begin to understand why certain people might begin to think, well, that sounds very planned in nature. Why is that not a planned situation? And there's nothing in the current recommendations that really helps to clarify that. So my observations on where we currently are then is I think that creates a sort of a general complexity with the current advice, and certainly inconsistencies and confusion between different countries, because there is these gaps in how it applies, or it doesn't seem logical necessarily. There's also a few oddities. So although I'm sure plenty of people in this room can explain the logic why it drove to this situation, as a layperson coming to it, why uranium and thorium mining, if you're going to mine it for its use in a reactor or in the nuclear fuel cycle, is a planned situation. But if I'm mining it for another reason, or if I'm in a mine where I'm not, I'm detecting a different material, but norm is present, that's an existing exposure situation. But the hazard is the same, and the people being exposed are the same, they're all mining. So why is that there? It's not immediately obvious from the recommendations. And so I think at best there's things that need clarification. Going back to the example I was just using, are these cases where you're choosing to use a material instead of something else that might not be radioactive? Is that really an existing exposed situation, or is it something different? Oops, sorry. So that goes to the key question asked for this talk, which is, is norm always an existing exposed situation? It sounds planned to a layperson. Should certain uses of norm make more sense to be controlled as a planned exposed situation? And there's some arguments for why that might be a good case. It seems to reflect that the reality that there is a decision being made about choosing to use that as opposed to something else. The justification side of things also links into that. You're justifying using that materials instead of something that's non-radioactive, which is the planned approach, rather than justifying an intervention activity, which is the existing exposure framework. And also would align with some of the other definitions. Those definitions of the exposed situations I put up at the start, actually, it doesn't mention anything about artificial nuclides being planned and naturally occurring stuff being existing. It's also about plans, when you can plan protection and measures in advance. Well, that seems to fit this definition to some extent. But there's also arguments against. It keeps it quite neat that all norm is an existing exposed situation, and also the concept that Nalia talked about, that generally we think about existing exposed situations are where there isn't the potential to create huge doses. You would have to be trying very hard to create a radiation emergency with norm. So there are sort of plenty of parallels that sit in the existing area as well. And that sort of really brings me to my key point. I'm not here to sort of say, I definitely think, we need to apply norm in some planned situations, or no, we don't. It's really just highlighting the inconsistencies and why those might be there. So I think the terms planned, existing, emergency are very logical. When you first think about it, you think, that covers everything I can think of. The problem is that those three words have everyday uses. If you went out onto the streets and said to someone, what's a planned situation? They would have an idea about what that is in their heads. And I don't think that's always what we mean it to be within the ICRP recommendations. It's almost we're using the word planned or word existing to apply to a particular framework of control measures, which isn't necessarily a one-to-one mapping with actually how people would understand that word to be applied, nor is it necessarily mapping to actually our own definitions, which are in ICRP 103. And so, as I said at the start, I think that highlights a problem larger than norm. I think it's across the board of the things we're looking at, that we need to think about the terminology and provide examples to help people through this and highlight that maybe it's not about being planned. It's not, as Anna said a few minutes ago, it's not about whether you can think in advance, oh yeah, okay, I can do something about this. It's about the type of source, the type of control measures that make sense, and the proportionality of those control measures. And also think that highlights a key point that we've got 3 exposure situations. It feels like a relatively straightforward concept at the start, but actually can lead to an awful lot of complexity and confusion when you try and apply them to real-world situations. So I think we need to be very careful that we don't lose sight that actually the point of all this is to have proportionate, pragmatic controls, not have a system where everything is perfectly classified and all the definitions make perfect sense and there's absolutely no room for moving one way or the other. It's about creating a system where we can help people to apply the correct control measures for the correct situation and get away from people being dragged into the wrong place because a word means something different to them than it does to everybody else. And as I say, that lack of clarity and consistency does lead to quite a lot of different approaches at the moment. In the task group already, we've heard examples from all over the world where the same situation, in this case norm, is dealt with very differently by different regulators and different national authorities. And I think just an interesting point to leave you on is just, why do we apply so much difference between norm and artificial radionuclides? At the end of the day, it's the same radiation that's coming out of it and the same biological effects. And there's, is there something around the public perception of the hazard, the fact that somehow people believe if it's naturally occurring, then it's got to be better for you than something that's man-made, and also the fact that norm industries were there long before sort of radiation was thought of, I think has kind of embedded things in the mindset, which we can't ignore, but I think we equally need to reflect why that's fed into our understanding, and sometimes seems to be contradictory to the science. So, yeah, that's my lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the next presentation will begin by Analia. So, yeah, the title is Some Issues in the Implementation of the Current System of Protection. So the floor is yours, okay. Analia.
Again, sorry. This presentation is of my behalf, of my thoughts, and just to share with you with issues we identify in the implementation of the current system of protection. I have first 3 or 4 slides about norm that they are very much in relation with what Chris has mentioned, but we need more clarity about the definition of exposure situation and how they had to be interpreted to be best applied. We need to have clarification what are, for example, I want to say the opposite as the other presentation. What are the characteristics of a planned exposure? It is a deliberate introduction. The exposure can be anticipated from the beginning, from the design. The source is fully characterized, can lead to an emergency exposure situation. That these points in favor to clarify what is a deliberate and it's a planned exposure situation. And sometimes happen that because you can control an existing exposure situation, this is a planned exposure situation. I think, for example, in my country, we had some problems with the terminology, with plan, because they say, we can plan, it is exist, but we can plan. Yes, okay, you can apply the procedure, but it's how the interpretation of the term. Also, I think it's not only how the exposure situations are interpreted, are classified, is how the tools that you have to control the situation for each situation are understood. Our feeling is in institution that the reference level has not been well understood what they imply in practice when you apply a reference level. This means flexibility means it is not well protected, for example. That is why regulators, we want to apply always those limits. But this is a reality, so we need to clarify how this is applied. Also important is the justification principles in, for example, existing exposure situation. It is on the decision to implement a protection strategy. We think that it's not on the decision, like a planned exposure, to add exposure to some individuals. And some things in this example, we don't believe, or do you believe, it is reasonable to justify, for example, an oil and gas industry because it could cause some not certain exposure from norm. This is very different from how the history has been done, but this makes sense. It's just to pose a question, just to think what will be the implications of the applications of the principles. Also, there is not some clarification and guidance how the optimization principle is applied in existing exposure situation and the graded approach in practice. We have to take into account the risk, the proportion with the other hazards, the controls that are already in place from conventional protection, the possibilities. And this is something that we are discussing in our institution. Although, suppose we agree that it is an existing exposure situation, from the beginning, from the start, maybe why not to define some screening levels in an exemption-like process? This will help a lot, for example, to regulators to define the scope, what we need to control or not. It is an exemption-like process because exemption is a term related with plan. But the idea is we need maybe some operative values to help the control. So we think that if reference levels are better explained, maybe the idea of those limits and occupational requirements may be applied only if it is needed, depending on the characteristics of the situation. And in that case, maybe reference level could be accepted as good tools to achieve protection. As Chris mentioned, we need to assure the best protection in relation with the prevailing circumstances. At least we discussed a lot this. We think that at least it is not a matter if it is a planned exposure situation, it is an existing exposure situation. We need to take into account the all hazard approach and the reasonableness concept. So this is maybe an idea, but I want to share with you. Maybe from a specific case where it is difficult to classify if it is a planned exposure, it is an existing exposure, to have the idea, they say, okay, we have the system of protection, we have all the tools, we have reference levels, those constraints, those limits, requirements, maybe screening levels, and explore the idea that to use an appropriate use of the tools for the situation, avoiding over-regulation. And as my colleague mentions, focus on the practicability and the pragmatic attitude of the situation. And in my country, it's very important to avoid over-regulation. So there are other issues that we know that are coming, and the framework is not clear. That is for reuse and recycling. And that protection strategies has to be in line with the sustainability principles and safety. There is an important meeting in the agency linking sustainability with safety in this moment. So maybe we have to rethink, in this case, the justification principle in a holistic optimization, and justification and holistic optimization, and justification in a broader sense, taking into account the benefit to society and environment as a whole. Again, we need to define some indicators for our overall well-being that we heard the presentation the first day. Also, how to integrate the ethical values and these sustainable development goals, taking into account the circumstances to take the better, reasonable decisions. There are some documents in relation with this reuse and recycling that those criteria for public exposure is in the order of 1 millisievert per year. But there are documents that also are a little contradictory. So the idea is this is reference levels, like looking, for example, for recycling or reuse for building materials. It is a dose limit. Just to think. And also, we think that maybe values may be too restrictive and could hinder activity with significant sustainable development benefits. Maybe we need more flexibility. Just to show you, I know dilution is prohibited, I know, but maybe justify dilution, for example, making a safety assessment and demonstration of the benefits, looking for sustainability. And something important, we have to remember that we have to provide information to the public. So, do we have a clear message to inform the public? very quickly, for radon topics, some radon to clarify. It is written that if you are above the reference level, you need to implement actions and apply requirements for occupational exposure. But this means it is converted an existing exposure situation in a planned exposure situation applying those limits. We need this, or we need more flexibility. And another issue that many countries face is what happens if we are below in radon, below the reference levels? Because we said optimization has to be applied. But indeed, many countries use it as an action level. So maybe we need more clarification on this. An important issue is the trade of commodities. And commodities, as you know, it is an harmonized issue, so it's very important that we have a global agreement about how to manage the levels of radionuclides, because this can cause transboundary issues. As we don't know the origin, because the origin may be from natural and regulated practices, fallout from releases, legacies, it is a cross-cutting issue. So we can say that it is not a plan, it is not an emergency, so maybe it's more like an existing exposure situation. If you analyze all the guidance that are published, it is a very complex issue, and it has many inconsistencies in the terminology, those criteria, how to consider the representative person. And also, we need to have operative, practical elements to make decisions at borders in a practical way. So, related with exposure, it is more related with an existing exposure situation, but we need also to have some operative values, some screening values, something that you can measure in the borders in an exemption-like process. The system in this case has to be simplified to understand for the public. And in this and everything regarding radiation protection, we need public trust. And we need global harmonization. It can be possible that one country takes some levels another level. Surprisingly, this issue of like an exemption-like process or some levels in existing exposure situation is not new. In ICRP 1 or 4 that define the scope of radiological protection, it talks about to avoid unnecessary restriction in trade, and maybe it's important or necessary to derive some levels indicating the line for freely permitted for export or imports. And this type of level of no action is something that the agency is implemented through member states in an exemption-like process in this GCS 17. So it's something to think how we can help the process. My last point is regarding occupational exposure in existing exposure situations. ICRP has a definition of occupational exposure in ICRP 103, and it says it's related with the work situation that can be reasonable regarded as being the responsibility of the operating management. And then in ICRP 126, that it is for radon, it says that in most workplaces, radon exposure are adventitious. They are not caused by the work, so are not considered occupational. But I still need some clarification because we have workers that exposed to radon, and depends of the operating management, but we consider members of the public. I'm not saying it is wrong, just saying that we need some clarification in these two definitions. So what type of workers we are considering in this moment and we are discussing for existing exposure situations? Workers related with the work that they take and maybe the levels of exposure they are involved. So remediation workers, for example, from a legacy, considered as occupational exposed workers with those levels at those constraints. Then we can have workers not related with remediation that are considered members of the public. But in the middle, it is recognized that we can have some workers involved in remediation, but whose work is very exceptional. Like, for example, an electrician that is applied to make some specific work of him, but not related with a remediation, but is in the remediated area. So maybe we need flexibility. It is occupational export worker or not. And it's also here a legal issue about how to be considered this worker. Then, for example, for norm, it's like the same as for radon from the beginning considered as it is advantageous, a non-occupational exposed worker, and depending of the levels, depending of the matter of the job, of the risk, may be considered occupational exposed workers. Besides, we have in-air crew that are considered occupational and reference levels apply. So you'll see we have different type of workers. And this is my last slide. We consider that the system of protection needs to be understandable for all the people, regulators, practitioners, public, radiation protection professionals. I think we need to apply simplification where possible. This will help communication and clarity. Clarity on how ethical values and social values are applied in the different situations. More clarity on how justification and optimization principles are applied in existing exposure situation. Also this issue of the occupational exposure. The system needs to be stable, but also needs clarification. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. And I will introduce the next speakers. So Lorenzo Nicola Mazzoni is a medical physics expert and radiation protection expert working in public health care systems in Tuscany. Sorry, my poor pronunciation in Italian. His work is mainly devoted to radiation protection of patients, workers, and the population, risk management, optimization, considering also other sources of physical agents such as electromagnetic fields and lasers. So, floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much, Hiroko. Thank you all. Well, now we switch between situations to categories of exposure because our task group has to deal also with the difficulties in the application of categories of exposure in practice. And we also change the setting because we go to the hospital now. The existence of different categories of exposure is often reflected in regulatory systems and day-to-day practice, where the management of a protection of patients on one side and workers and public on the other side can be quite separated. And the reasons of this can be easily understood if we think at the peculiarities that patient exposure have, the specific characteristics. For example, the third principle that does not apply, the fact that optimization is deeply focused on clinical outcome, and all these things that do not apply to workers and public protection. These reflect usually in different professionals involved taking decisions for patient protection and workers and public protection, possibly a quite separated application of the optimization principle in day-to-day practice. But in the hospital settings, we all know that staff and public exposures are related with patient exposures. For example, in interventional radiology, staff exposure mostly depends on radiation scattered by the patient, so the patient becomes the main source of exposure for the staff. Here you can see a typical scenario of an interventional radiology room where we have the X-ray source below the patient that exposes the heart of a patient for diagnostic purposes. The detector is above the patient. And if you look at the position of a medical doctor, it is clear that he has to act in close proximity with the source and is exposed by the radiation scattered by the patient. So the medical doctor exposure strongly depends on parameters that are related with the clinical outcome. A similar scenario can be found in nuclear medicine, where the patient is injected with a radioactive tracer and has to be assisted. So we have a patient again that becomes the main source of exposure for the staff. Those are two easy examples that I would like to show to you of interconnection between the exposure of patient and staff. In those cases, we have a patient that become the main source of exposure. We can find different day-to-day scenarios where the connections are more complicated. Maybe the patient cannot be the source of exposure, but where still we have an interconnection because the practice at the very end is one, and we have different actors exposed. But if you want to summarize what I was just showing to you, we have an X-ray source in those two examples that it is used to expose a patient for a diagnostic or therapeutic purpose, and we have a medical exposure. And when we have a patient that becomes the main source of exposure for the staff, and we have a professional exposure. And as I said at the beginning, usually these two categories of exposure can be treated in a quite separated way. But it is not possible to optimize staff exposure without considering patient exposure, as they are part of the same exposure pathway. This point has been addressed by many ICRP publications on dealing with specific scenarios. For example, ICRP publication 139 says that occupational exposure in interventional procedures is closely related to patient exposure, and therefore, management of occupational protection should be integrated with patient protection. Measures to protect staff should not impair the clinical outcome and should not increase patient exposure. In fact, the justification of the exposures of all patient, staff, also public, is mainly driven by patient benefit at 99%. So radiological protection provision for all has to be consistently planned considering the focus of the practice, that is the patient benefit, the clinical outcome. Okay, so please let me summarize the difficulty in the application of the system that I want to bring to your attention. As I said at the beginning, the existence of different categories of exposure is often reflected in regulatory systems and day-to-day practice, where the management of the protection of patients on one side and workers and public on the other side can be quite separated. While in practice, exposures optimization requires a deeply integrated approach. In fact, there is one practice, usually one X-ray source, one justification, the patient benefit, one optimization, that of the whole practice, and two strategies of protection. As you see, here we can have a weakness in the application of a system. So this is my last slide. A possible step further. This is just a proposal that I want to bring to your attention and to possibly get feedback on this proposal from the audience during the question and answer session. The idea is to generalize what ICRP publication 139 stated for interventional radiology. This is the proposal. In the medical field, the justification for the exposure of workers and general public is mainly driven by the patient benefit. Therefore, radiological protection provisions for workers and the public exposed as a result of a medical exposures should be managed in an integrated manner with patient exposure. In particular, provisions dedicated to workers and public protection should not limit the clinical outcome and should take into account the interconnections between patient and staff public exposure to ensure an adequate application of the optimization principle for all. So, this is the proposal, but before leaving the stage, please let me thank you all for your kind attention. Also thank to all the members of Task Group 127, and in particular to Analia, Hiroko, and Ian. Thank you so much.
Yes, now we are going to have the presentation of Hiroko Yoshida about the issues and confusions in an existing exposure situation after the Fukushima accident.
Thank you, Narian. I'm Hiroko Yoshida, the member of Task Group 127. And first of all, the 2 points should be noted that the one is I use ICRP templates for my PowerPoint files, but this is not authorized by ICRP. This is, the came from my own perspectives based on the experiences after the Fukushima nuclear power plant accident. And also, I put stress on the existing exposure situation that after large-scale nuclear power plant accident is totally different from other existing exposure situations such as NOM or the radon or the cosmic radiation in aviation, and also just a small contaminated area. And for example, the existing exposure situation after the large-scale nuclear power plant accident includes all exposure situations from emergency and existing and plans and go back to normal time and with transition. Then the existing exposure situation after large nuclear accident was first introduced in publication 103, as you know. So that is a 2007 general recommendation. And in 2020, publication 146 was published, and it's updated to publication 109 and publication 111. Then publication 103, and as already mentioned, the exposure from past events and accidents, so that is one of our existing exposure situations. And also publication 103 shows the table 4, those constraints and reference levels used in the Commission's system of protection. And for the emergency exposure situations, the reference level is recommended to use for occupational exposure, but it has footprints. So you can see here, long-term recovery operations should be treated as part of planned occupational exposure. And also for existing exposure situations, occupational exposure is not applicable, but also it has footnotes. So exposures resulting from long-term remediation operations or from protracted employment in affected areas should be treated as part of planned occupational exposure, even though the source of radiation is existing. Actually, these are very confusing. Then in publication 146, it says in emergency and existing exposure situations, the first two fundamental principles, that is the justification and optimization principles, should be used, and the application of those limits is not appropriate. That is, based on 103. Then now I will introduce one of issues and confusions on site. So immediately after the Fukushima accident, that was on March in 2011, so the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, they enacted the special ministerial ordinance enacted, that is the upper dose limit for workers engaged in emergency work was raised from 100 millisievert to 250 millisievert. That is, emergency. And but however, it was abolished after the stability of the reactor was ensured. So subsequently, it became necessary to comply with those limits in the planned exposure situations. So it revealed the difficulty in implementing the reference levels to practical the situations in Japan. So the ICRP recommendations of setting reference levels dependent on the exposure situation, emergency and existing exposure situation was hardly accepted by society. And probably there might be some reasons for this. So the ICRP recommendations and the reference levels might not have been explained well and widespread enough in society to be fully understood. And also the mainstream idea in society and the regulatory body or other relevant authority in Japan is that safety standards should be based on the single dose level. So the implementation is very difficult, is very it's hard in the society, in the practical use. Then publication 146 said it describes the phases of managing the large nuclear accidents as shown in this figure. So for early stage and intermediate phases, emergency exposure situation is applied, and for long-term phase, existing exposure situation is applied. Then the Commission recommends a set of reference levels for the optimization of protection of the general population and responders, both on site and off-site for all accident phases. So this is a categories of exposure in publication 146 for emergency exposure situations, and also existing exposure situation for responders on site, off-site, and public. So now I will show you another issue and the confusion off-site. And in this figure, I can show you the dose rate of Japan in May 2012, so 1 year after the accident. So you can see, around the area around the Fukushima prefecture, it was affected largely, but in other parts of Japan, it was not affected by the Fukushima accident. So after a large nuclear accident, to what extent should we considered to be in an existing exposure situation? Are all regions in Japan in an existing exposure situation? Or if unaffected areas should also be considered in existing exposure situation, when will it end? These are the questions that came from the public and the other the people in Fukushima and the other sites of Japan. So, for example, after Chernobyl accident, some radioactivity was found in practically every country of the northern hemisphere. So it means every country of the northern hemisphere has been considered in an existing exposure situation. Or another example is the entire world has been affected by the fallout from atmospheric nuclear testings. So the entire world has been in an existing exposure situations. So there is no clear description in the previous ICRP publications. I don't know, this is the range that ICRP should cover, but I just show the people's confusion and the issues. So anyway, existing exposure situations after a large nuclear accident should be more clarified. That is a request from the people in Japan. And also I show you another figure that describes the changes in air dose rates in Fukushima prefecture, and even in Fukushima prefecture and the area around the Fukushima prefecture. So in October 2022, so last year, that is 11 years after the Fukushima accident, so you can see, in many areas, radiation dose went back to the normal range. And of course, the only the radiation dose is not a factor to decide the phase, but that is one factor. Then I also show you another issue and the confusion off-site 12 years after the accident, because after the evacuation order was lifted, hospitals, clinics, and the dental clinics are being reopened or newly established as more residents return home or start new residences, and the people need medical care. So the hospital clinics is required. So based on Public 103. Workers' exposure in medicine in these areas should be treated as occupational or public exposure. And if their exposure is treated as public exposure, it means that workers in medicine will be excluded from legal protection systems from occupational exposure. Or how should workers' radiation exposure be managed as public exposure? Because the reference level is bound, the lowest the level is below 1 millisievert per year. And occupational and public exposure in an existing exposure situation after large-scale nuclear power plant accident should be more clarified and well explained into society. So that is, thank you very much.
Thank you, Hiroko. Then we have our last presentation from Olvido Guzman, representing the Atomic Energy Agency, exposure categories and situation in the current system of radiation protection, main challenges and agency's activities to assist its member states in addressing them. You have the floor.
Yeah, we haven't introduced her yet. So Olvido Guzman is the head of the Radiation Protection Unit at the IAEA and the secretary of the Radiation Safety Standards Committee, or RASC. Physicist with over 30 years of experience in RP, has previously worked for the Spanish and the French regulators, as well as for the OECD NIR and HELCA, ensuring the scientific secretariat of several of their committees and groups such as CRPPH or WPNEM or ISOE and etc., from which she has had the opportunity to cover all the 3 types of exposure situations and the categories of exposures. So, Olvido, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hiroko and Analia. And thank you very much for the opportunity to the agency to present our experience in implementation of the system of radiation protection, in particular on categories of exposure and type of exposure. So I suppose that all of you know who is the International Atomic Energy Agency, so I will not take a lot of time to present it. So, but one of the activities that are under our mandate is to establish or adopt standards of safety for protection of health and minimization of danger to life and property, and also to provide for the application of these standards. And we have this mission for all our member states that in total account in 2023 to the number of 178 member states. So just to illustrate how we do this mission, or how we undertake this mission, on how we support our member states in developing and applying radiation safety standards. So we work with our member states to establish effective regulatory systems on radiation protection and safety, and also we assist our member states in making use of nuclear and radiological technologies in a peaceful way. And by doing these activities, the IAEA not only contributes to building an harmonized system of radiation protection worldwide, but also we have the privilege to collect feedback on their implementation, and this allows also to contribute to future improvement of the system. And during this presentation, I will try to provide some insights on this feedback. So the methods and tools that we have for this mission on developing and applying radiation safety standards are various. Here are some examples. So main one is the development of safety standards, but also we have other publications publications that support our member states. We have technical cooperation projects in which we may support national or regional projects. And also we have webinars, training materials, conferences, and one of also of the tools that I will show some of the outcomes are review missions and advisory services to see what is the status of the implementation of our safety standards in the member states. And in undertaking these mission and activities, we don't work alone. We don't work only with our member states, but it is very important to ensure international coordination. And in this sense, mainly we have an interagency committee on radiation safety in which we work together with other relevant international organizations that have competencies in radiation protection, namely WHO, ILO, EC, UNSCARE, NEA, ICRP, IRPA, etc. In terms of our collaboration with ICRP, let me just briefly highlight that this is a long-standing collaboration that dates back almost to the beginning of our mission on developing standards. But more recently, in 2014, the date of publication of our main standard in radiation protection, we set up or we formalized this long-standing collaboration through a formal agreement. And we collaborate with ICRP in many ways through this interagency committee. And also, ICRP is an observer in the committee that develops radiation safety standards, RASC, and also in other relevant safety standards in the agency. And also, IEA is a member of ICRP in some of the task groups, like this one, Task Group 127. And also, IEA as agency is a member of the ICRP Spatial Liaison Organization Group. And this collaboration is somehow illustrated in examples of joint activities. One of them is the joint ICRP IEA topical session that we held during RASC meeting in 2022 that was dedicated to the review of the RP system after the publication of ICRP of the plans to review the system. So, what is how the ICRP recommendations are embedded in the IEA standards? As I mentioned, GSR Part 3 is General Safety Requirements. Part 3 is the main safety standards in the agency related to radiation protection, and it is built in the RP system as described in ICRP 103 and the supplementary recommendations. And one important aspect is that it is endorsed by a number of international organizations, and this is very important because it reflects consensus, very broad and worldwide, and this is of paramount importance for the system and practice of radiation protection. One important aspect is that all this set of IEA safety requirements after ICRP 103 has been only recently been completed, and the associated safety guidance are most of them published but not fully completed, and some of them are still in preparation. And in many countries worldwide, and especially for the majority of member states of the agency, the IEA safety guidance are often used as the basis for their national legislation. And we are not the only ones that are focusing on the implementations, but also other international organizations are focusing on assisting their member states in this endeavor. And in this context, the IEA calls for stability of the system because we believe this is of paramount importance, especially after having seen that the system is fit for purposes, even if, as I will express and I will show, it may need some clarification. When it comes to the topic of our session on exposure categories and situations in GSR Part 3, for the purpose of establishing the requirements, the practical requirements, GSR Part 3 distinguishes the three types of exposure situations, as in ICRP 103, planned, emergency, and existing, that has already been described during this session. And we also incorporated the three categories of exposures: occupational, public, and medical. At that time already, when developing GSR Part 3, the IEA experience already showed and recognized that the description of these three types of exposure situations could not be always sufficient to determine univocally which type of exposure situations may apply for specific circumstances. And one of the major challenges that we had was related at that time. I am talking now about the development of the GSR Part 3, not the implementation. But it was recognized at that time that many of the challenges could refer to the existing exposure situations, and this has been repeated by many of my fellow colleagues here. And so why it was so complicated? Because under this scope or terminology or concept of existing exposure situations, it is included a very varied range of exposures, and the way to manage may require very different approaches. So we have already mentioned, and you already know the activities. So they refer to radon, to norm cosmic radiation, commodities, remediation from past activities, but also from past accidents. And this may already bring some challenges in the consistency of managing all these exposure situations. And it was recognized at that time that some exposures that presented already exceptional circumstances should be treated separately, and this is the way that was reflected in GSR Part 3. And these were the transition from an emergency situation to an existing exposure situation, and also some exposures due to natural sources, which may have some characteristics of both planned exposure situations and also existing exposure situations. Needless to say that it was also already advanced at that time that to implement the radiation protection system for these types of situation would require, as also for other types, but in particular for this one, high level of professional knowledge and value judgment. Now, if we move to what is the experience of the agency in the implementation of the requirements, what we have seen is that the member states' challenges do not concern the radiation protection system itself, but rather the implementation of the system. And to illustrate with two examples, in the upper part of this slide, you have an analysis, an overview. Of course, you don't need to see the details of the IRS missions. IRS is the Integrated Regulatory Review Service related to GSR Part 3. And what can be concluded from this analysis is that the requirements, which are with the higher columns, are those presenting more challenges because they have drawn more recommendations or suggestions, and they mainly refer, as I am saying, to the implementation. For instance, to the establishment of the legal and regulatory framework. This is one of the main ones, and also the responsibilities of the government. And they also relate to medical exposure and public exposure, exemption and clearance, to name some examples. These data are very similar because the data for other analyses is not yet available, but they are almost similar. These data reflect data from 2006-2017, so 3 years after the publication of GSR Part 3. But more recently, what the IEA has been called or has been drawn attention is that member states have numerous challenges in the implementation of the concept of existing exposure situations and the requirements from GSR Part 3. So the identification and management of these existing exposure situations is not fully understood by many member states, I would say the majority of member states. And in this context, even if the agency had already developed a numerous guidance on some of the areas related to radiation protection in existing exposure situations, our member states have requested us to develop a new one. And the new one should be new in the sense that it shouldn't focus on specific areas of existing exposure situations, but should be more like a kind of overarching guidance that should cover all the type of exposure under existing exposure situations, and to meet the GSR Part 3 requirements for existing exposure situations. So just to summarize, this guidance is now under development. In the terminology of the agency, it is known as DS 544, and it is now on step 5 out of the 14 steps in the development of safety standards in the agency. And this guidance that is going to address in this overarching and comprehensive way all existing exposure situations in one single document. The idea is, as requested by our member states, is to bring consistency in the management and scope of all these existing exposure situations, and also fill the gaps, because in some of the guidance, some areas may not be fully covered. And one important aspect that was requested by our member states also was not to duplicate what the guidance that already exists, but to provide the necessary reference and to guide the reader to find what are the specific guidance that apply for a specific existing exposure situations. So taking into account the ambitious project and the complexity to cope with such a varied range of exposure situations, there was a need to establish a strategic approach, somehow different to traditional way of developing standards in the agency. First, it's going to be needed, because it's still ongoing, to have an in-depth analysis of already existing guidance, and also, of course, have the traditional consultancy meetings. But also, it was very important to have a broad view and extend the understanding of the agency for all the member states, and not only the ones that requested this guidance, that were the members of RASC. Just to give you an idea, we have 70 member states in RASC. All member states are invited to take part in the committee, but not all of them nominate experts. So what we have done is that we have also, as part of this strategic approach, organized regional workshops trying to outreach those member states that normally don't participate in IEA activities directly in the agency. So you have here the proposed table of contents.
You have 2 minutes.
Okay, 2 minutes?
2 minutes.
Okay, so this is the regional workshops, as I was mentioning. So we outreach 71 member states that complements the representativeness of those in RASC. In these workshops, we followed a similar structure with a survey, a questionnaire, and we cover in sessions on remediation, radon, norm commodities, and we work in groups also to enhance collaboration and better participation in them. So, and just to summarize some of the issues that we identified, in fact, I could almost skip many of these aspects because they have already been covered by my colleagues. But again, to emphasize, the concept of existing exposure situations is very, very poorly understood in many member states. There is a lack of regulatory framework in the majority of these member states, and in particular in the field of norm, there is a strong request to have more clear guidance on how to manage these industries as a whole. So there are challenges, again, as mentioned by my colleagues, in applying the justification principle, and optimization, the graded approach, and so on. There is a lot of difficulties for member states in understanding why in existing exposure situations it is used a bound between 1 and 20 millisievert to protect the public in terms of reference level, and then for plant exposure situations there is a limit of 1 millisievert. This is really very complicated to understand, at least, and namely for the participants in these regional workshops. Another challenge added to this management is the particularity that many authorities are involved in these existing exposure situations, and these add challenges in coordination. There was also an issue on terminology, adding more difficulties in this management, just to name a few: reference level, screening values, exemption-like processes, commodities. And there was also issues in managing residual contamination from nuclear accidents, as also expressed by Hiroko. And again, and as it was anticipated, there was also a confusion on why and how to apply requirements for planned exposure situations to existing exposure situations. Why remediation workers are considered as occupationally exposed, to name some examples, and there are many others. So just to conclude and to summarize, so there are some areas in general, in terms of category of exposures and type of exposure, where the implementation of safety standards based in the recommendations of ICRP have led to challenges in member states. And the important takeaway lesson is that these challenges concern the implementation of or interpretation of the radiation safety standards rather than the radiation protection system itself. And the identification of the requirements in one of the three exposure situations and the three category of exposures is one of the major challenge, as well as the implementation of the justification and optimization principles and the consistent protection strategies for existing exposure situations. So many of our member states, what they mention is that the system has become too complex, and that sometimes during some of these discussions, it was concluded by many of them that the fact that if we distinguish between, or we categorize an exposure as planned or existing, sometimes it not adds more protection than the one already existing in the particular country.
Time is over.
And time's over. So IA supports more clarity and consistency, but the system is fit for purpose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So please, thank you very much to all the speakers. So now we open the session for discussion. I think we have time maybe to 2 or 3 questions, burning questions, comments. Yes, please. I don't know the microphone. Microphone.
Thank you very much. I'm Mika Markkanen from Finland Stuk. One quick question. One of the big kind of mega trends which I am hearing during this symposium and earlier is that we want to have a decision making, such a kind of a holistic approach. When we are doing decisions for justification or optimization, we want to consider all the hazards in an integrated manner. I think that's one of the big approaches. But in case of existing exposure situation, like we heard in the presentation, the decision about radiation protection is to whether or not to implement the protection strategy. And you are saying that we are not dealing with the overall justification of the overall new practice. For example, starting a new mine. So isn't that a little bit contradicting that on the other hand, we want to have an integrated approach for overall decision making for starting an activity, but in this case, in normal industry, we are pushing us away from the decision making, because when we make the, let's say, first decision whether you start, for example, a mining activity, the radioactivity can be a very important part of the overall decision making. So we should be in the picture, not taking us out from the picture, and only deciding on whether or not implement the protection strategy. So if the presenters can comment this, I would appreciate it.
Thank you for the question. I think the general justification approach, I think what you've just given is a highlight of some of what we've been talking about, where it sometimes doesn't make sense. Existing exposed situation is just such a large category that broadly the idea that justification is about how you, whether or not you take intervention activities, I think in many cases makes sense. If you've got a long-standing, if you've got a radon problem or something, then that makes sense. You're not going to justify that I've got radon, it's already there. So, okay, so how are we just going to justify how far we go to solve it? But you've then got other things, and I think that was the whole point I was getting at, where somehow it sort of we seem to be confusing an existing situation because the source is existing, and an existing situation or planned situation because we're going to do something new, and how do you make all that work together? And I don't know, Chris, I mean, to go to your point, it's we've got to get that balance right. We need to be involved in that decision making, but equally we don't want to go where we choose not to open a new mine because of the radiation implications. Just clearly that's probably going to be a very minor consideration of the overall sort of concern. So it's how you get in there in a proportionate manner, and I think that's the challenge. Does anyone else want to?
Just to make a comment, the idea is that, for example, if you have norm industry, you have to recognize, identify your industry. For example, if you have no uranium mining, because uranium mining is already licensed in every country. But the idea is to characterize, and if you have to take decisions, that you have to justify, by the idea is to characterize which are the risks, which are the problems with radiation. And then, if it is decided to take actions, that to take into account in an integrated approach with the other hazards and the other protection strategies that are already in place, that sometimes they protect from radiation, but they don't know that they protect from radiation. But the idea is not to say that if it is an existing exposure situation, we are going to be flexible and we are not going to protect the worker. This is important to clarify. It's just how the principle is applied. And the idea is that you have to take into account the other hazards, not focus only in radiation. But of course, we need more discussion about this. Please, other comment? Abel, I didn't see you.
Well, from the talks and the discussions, I believe that it's obvious that we have a problem of language, that we have not been very precise in the language that we use, and then if it is imprecise in English, when we translate, it became even worse. And this creates problems then of communication. Let me give an example of several examples that happened during this session. Analia used the word commodities, in spite that in the agency we came to the conclusion that it was a mistake to use the word commodity. And I can say it was a mistake because I did that mistake. For mea culpa, it's me. This was done when Belarus, after the Chernobyl accident, wanted a resolution. The problem of Belarus was wood, and they didn't want that wood appear in the resolution because otherwise Belarus will be identified. For we tried to find the generic word, and the generic was commodities. And I put commodities, and then I realized that commodities is wrong in English because it's coming from Latin commodus, that means to be comfortable, and cannot be translated to any other language because nobody understands what commodities means. The Coca-Cola is commodity, eh? No, depends what you think about Coca-Cola. I mean, we go all around the world, it can be a commodity. In the agency, we decided to use consumer goods, and there are many reasons why the word consumer good have to be used. If this is translatable to any language, everybody understands what a consumer good is. You go to a shop and you buy something, this is a consumer good. The other typical example that was presented by your presentation is the confusion on existing exposure situation. And that is much more difficult to resolve. In Latin languages, many of them at least, there are two verbs for the verb to be. One is a permanent to be, and the other one is a transitory to be. And what we are going on existing exposure situation is very difficult, very different for people dealing with the situation, if the situation is permanent or if it is transitory. And existing do not separate that. Existing, people, depending how you understand, can be permanent or transitory. In the original draft of the ICRP 103, we use the word extant to make that difference, but somebody told that extant never crossed the North Atlantic, and nobody will understand in America, well, therefore, existing was used. And people are confused. And they are correctly confused. It's not the same for somebody dealing with a permanent situation than dealing with a transitory situation. And it was a problem in Fukushima. It's a problem of language that we have to express clearly what we are saying. And And then the maximum maximorum, of course, is the word dose limit that we continue to use as our dogma, is our Bible, dose limit. Well, I tell you what the people in Japan were saying. So you told me that the dose limit was 1 millisievert before the accident, and now that there is an accident, and I want to be more protected, you tell me at least 20. But who can understand that? Only us. It's crazy. There was an ICRP group that recommend that we deal with that. This was nearly 10 years ago. Nothing has been done. We continue to say dose limit. We could use another expression. We can say, I don't know, the restriction for a planet situation. I don't know. But certainly not a limit, because I don't know very well English, and probably limit in English is more elastic. But I tell you that in Japanese, limit is not an elastic word. A limit is a limit. And you cannot go above the limit. And our standards say that we can go a limit up to 100. For what we call a limit? 1. Well, I give you just 3 examples of things that were discussed in this meeting, but I believe I believe that we have to make an effort to be careful on the language that we use, because as we said in the communication, even if you use the right language, it's very difficult to communicate. But if you use the wrong language, certainly will not communicate. Thank you.
Thank you, Abel. Any other question, or we just Miroslav?
Thank you very much. That will be short. So I'm Miroslav Piňák. I am the radiation from IEA. I am responsible for the section which is dealing with preparation of the standards and application of the standards. And what I am hearing, excellent presentation, all of you, thank you very much. This is very lesson learned for us, and probably indication how to move forward with further things. But I don't want to be philosophical here. But just I would like to say, what I'm hearing from presentations, there are issues. There are issues with existing exposure situation. All we do explain clearly, we must develop the existing exposure situation guidance documents, not because of improving safety, because of clarifying which kind of applications or requirements should be applied when, whether it's existing, whether it's planned, what is it, what I apply. We have standards, we have requirements, but we don't know where to put them. And this is improving safety from the point of view of health effects, or it is just helping to regulators to allocate a particular situation to particular box? My question is, or just question, rhetorical question, I would say, first principle of the ICRP concerning the radiation protective justification. Any alteration of radiation or exposure should bring more benefit than harm, something like that. It's not quoting. My question is, and I really thank to ICRP to introducing this new task group dealing with these exposure situations, because probably now it's time to reflect the situation, the discussion with Mr. Gonzalez just is described. When were these 3 categories exposures introduced? Did they bring more benefit from the point of view of radiation safety, or more complication to allocate certain group of activities, medical one, after emergency, and so on, from the point of view of improving safety? Can someone, is it time now to reflect this decision before? I don't know. I'm just asking this myself because I'm in charge in the position, but also to other group of radiation safety. Maybe let's look back. What has been brought, particularly with existing exposure situation. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you very much, Miroslav. We have discussed, we have to discuss, we have to think, we have to take into account the stability, which will be the benefit, but we need clarification. We need to clarify to the practitioners, to the people, to the public, what is behind our recommendations. So we have to close the session. So thank you very much for the speakers, chair, co-chair, rapporteur, and all the people for your patience. Thank you very much.